The moment I picked up that custody file, I wasn't thinking about the past. I was thinking about the 8-year-old girl sitting across the room with her hands folded in her lap like she'd been taught to look invisible. Her grandmother had brought her in. "That was all the intake form," said grandmother, temporary guardian, seeking permanent custody. A routine case, the kind I handled 3 times a week. I was reaching for my pen when the little girl looked up at me, and the air left my lungs like someone had pressed both palms against my chest. She had his eyes. Not the color, not exactly, but the shape of them. The slight downward tilt at the outer corners that made people look like they were always about to say something tender. Ethan had eyes like that. I'd fallen in love with those eyes before I'd even learned his last name. I told myself I was being irrational. Plenty of children had eyes like that. I dropped my gaze back to the file and tried to breathe normally. And then I saw it. Around her neck, on a thin silver chain, hung a locket no bigger than a thumbnail. Simple. Oval-shaped. And on the front, hand-etched in letters so small you'd miss them if you weren't looking, the letter L. I had made that locket myself. I had sat at a craft table in a prenatal class in Columbus, Ohio, hunched over a metal stamp and a rubber mallet, pressing that letter into the silver with shaking, clumsy hands, crying because I was doing it alone and I didn't know how I was going to survive any of what was coming. I set my pen down very carefully. I looked at the little girl. I looked at the grandmother, a woman I didn't recognize, a hired caretaker, not blood. And I said, as steadily as I could manage, "I need to reschedule this appointment." 9 years. That's how long I'd been telling myself it was over. I met Ethan Hargrove the way you meet people when you're 24 and running on caffeine and ambition at a conference you don't want to be at, in a city you've never visited, in a room full of people who all seem to know each other. I was there on a scholarship from the Ohio State Legal Aid Clinic where I'd just started as a paralegal. He was there representing his family's foundation, the Hargrove Family Initiative, which donated millions every year to affordable housing and juvenile justice reform. He didn't lead with any of that. He led with the fact that the shrimp cocktail was deeply suspicious and he was thinking about abandoning the buffet entirely. I laughed. He laughed. We ended up talking for 4 hours. Ethan Hargrove was everything I had learned to distrust in wealthy men: old money, private school education, a last name that opened doors before he even knocked. But he didn't move through the world the way those men usually did. He didn't perform generosity. He just had it. Quietly, the way some people have good posture. It was built into him somewhere down deep. We were long distance for 6 months before he asked me to come to Columbus to be closer to him. I'd already been accepted to law school at Ohio State. It wasn't hard to say yes. By the time I started my first semester, I was spending most nights at his apartment, and by the time I finished my second year, he'd asked me to marry him in the parking lot of our favorite taco truck because he said he couldn't wait until somewhere nicer. I said yes in that parking lot, still holding a foil-wrapped burrito, laughing so hard I could barely get the word out. His mother said no. Not out loud. Not directly. Diana Hargrove was far too polished for anything as honest as that. She said it the way people who have attended the right schools say things, with warmth in her voice and ice underneath every syllable. She said it over dinners where she asked about my family and then went quiet in a particular way when I mentioned my dad drove a forklift. She said it in the slight pause before she complimented my dress, the pause that lasted just long enough to mean something. She hired someone to look into my background. I found out later, after everything. She'd had a private investigator dig up every scholarship application I'd ever submitted, every social media post, every photograph. She gave a carefully assembled folder of this information to Ethan and framed it as concern. She told him I was ambitious in a way that had nothing to do with love. That I had attached myself to him strategically, the way certain vines grow toward the most solid structure. Ethan came to my apartment the night she gave him that folder. He stood in my kitchen holding it and he looked so tired. So confused. "She thinks you're using me," he said. He didn't say he believed it. But he didn't say he didn't, either. We fought. The kind of fight that happens when two people have been carrying something heavy for a long time and finally put it down wrong. I told him his mother had never seen me as a real person. He told me I'd never tried to understand what it meant to be raised the way he was raised, with every decision scrutinized and every relationship treated as a potential liability. I took my engagement ring off. I set it on the kitchen counter. I told him that, if he couldn't trust me, then we were already over, and I walked out into a February night without my coat. He called twice. I didn't pick up. I found out he'd been in an accident from a mutual friend who texted me at 11:15 the next morning. The roads were icy. He'd been driving too fast. The friend didn't know the details, only that he'd been taken to the hospital, and then, 2 hours after that, a second text. "I'm so sorry, Claire. I drove to Ohio State Medical Center in a state that I cannot describe except to say that my body drove the car while the rest of me stood very still somewhere far away." In the waiting room, I found Diana Hargrove already there, upright in a chair, her coat buttoned to the throat, her face arranged into something composed and terrible. She looked at me the way you look at something you want to disappear. "You should go," she said. "I'm his fiancé." "You were." She turned back to face the wall in front of her. "He came back from your apartment last night, devastated. He wasn't in any state to drive. Whatever happened between you," she stopped. Let the silence finish the sentence for her. I didn't leave. I sat on the other side of the waiting room for 3 hours. At the end of those 3 hours, a doctor came out and said things I have never been able to fully reassemble into a coherent sequence. Something about the impact. Something about the time that passed before they could get to him. Something that ended with there being nothing more they could do. Diana walked out of that hospital without looking at me once. For 2 weeks, I barely moved. My roommate brought me food. My professors sent emails I didn't open. I sat in the dark in my apartment and thought about every version of the night before the accident where I made a different choice. Where I picked up the phone, where I didn't walk out, where I stayed. Then I discovered I was pregnant. I took the test at 6 in the morning, sitting on the bathroom floor, and when the second line appeared, I put my hand over my mouth and sat there for a very long time. My first feeling was grief, so acute it felt physical. My second feeling, arriving quietly behind the first, was something I didn't expect. Purpose. I had a reason. I had something to get up for. I had the only piece of Ethan that was still mine, and I was going to protect it with everything I had. I didn't contact Diana. There was no version of that conversation I could imagine going well. I told my parents, who drove up from Dayton and stayed for a weekend, and held my hands and didn't try to fix anything. I finished my semester. I worked at the legal aid clinic 20 hours a week and saved everything I could. I talked to the baby every night before I went to sleep, mostly just to say that we were going to be okay, both of us, that the world was harder than it should be, but we were going to figure it out together. I felt her kick for the first time at 19 weeks. I was sitting in a con law lecture, and I had to press my hand to my stomach and hold still. I whispered, "Hi," just that. The woman next to me gave me a strange look, and I didn't explain. I decided on a name, Lily. Just Lily. A name that belonged to no one but her. The labor started at 37 weeks, fast and hard, in the middle of the night. By the time I got to the hospital, I was already deep into contractions that left no space between them to breathe. A nurse named Teresa held my hand. I asked for Ethan once, reflexively, and then remembered, and Teresa just held my hand tighter and didn't say anything, which was the right thing. I pushed for 2 hours. I heard her cry. One cry high and furious and real, and then a sound I have spent 9 years trying to unhear, a silence that came too soon. A cluster of people gathered at the far end of the room. A machine beeped twice in a way that felt wrong. The nurse who had been at my side moved away. A doctor appeared and said something about the cord. Something about compression. Something about doing everything they could. They brought me a baby wrapped in a white blanket, small and still and pale. I held her. I memorized her face. I kissed her forehead. I said her name. But even through the fog of exhaustion and grief, something in me would not settle. Something that I tried for years to dismiss as the delusion of a woman whose mind had broken under too much loss. The baby in my arms, she felt wrong. Not wrong in an abstract way. Wrong in the way a parent knows, the way I had learned to know through 6 months of kicks and movement and one-sided conversations in the dark, I told the nurse. She looked at me with such practiced, careful sympathy that I almost believed her when she told me it was the shock. That grief did things to perception. That my baby was right here, right in my arms. I had been awake for 31 hours. I had no one with me. I let them tell me I was wrong. The funeral was private. I buried a white casket in a cemetery outside Columbus on a gray Tuesday in October with my parents on either side of me and a minister who had never met any of us. I had made a small silver locket the week before. In a prenatal craft class I had been too stubborn to stop attending. I placed it in the casket. I thought that was the end. I became a lawyer the way some people become soldiers. Not because I was drawn to it, but because I needed a container for everything I couldn't put anywhere else. I graduated. I passed the bar. I took a job at a nonprofit legal aid organization in Columbus that handled family law cases, custody disputes, termination of parental rights, child welfare hearings. The irony of this was not lost on me. I chose it anyway. Partly because the work mattered. Partly because being surrounded by other people's families was the only way I knew to stay close to the shape of what I'd lost without being destroyed by the actual memory of it. I was good at the job. I was precise, thorough, and I did not flinch at things that made other attorneys flinch. Clients trusted me, judges respected me. I was promoted to senior attorney at 31. People said I was exceptional. What I was empty. I had organized the emptiness into something that looked productive from the outside. I had learned to be very good at looking productive from the outside. I did not date. I did not let people close enough to ask the questions I didn't want to answer. I had a one-bedroom apartment near Goodale Park, a cat named Harold, and a routine I kept to with the precision of someone who knows that routine is the only thing standing between her and the abyss. And then a woman walked into my office with a little girl who had Ethan's eyes and a silver locket around her neck with a hand-etched letter L. I spent that night on the floor of my closet with a shoebox I hadn't opened in 9 years. Inside, an ultrasound photo. A tiny yellow onesie. The matching locket I had made for myself, the one I had intended to give to my daughter when she was old enough to wear it. And a receipt from the craft class, dated the week before the delivery. I held my locket next to a photograph I had taken of the girl before rescheduling the appointment. The lockets were identical. Same oval shape. Same chain gauge. Same hand-etched imperfection on the left side of the letter where my stamp had slipped. I did not sleep. The next morning, I called in a favor from a colleague who worked in hospital records. I told her I needed information about a birth at Ohio State Medical Center 9 years ago, October. I told her I had reason to believe there had been an irregularity. It took her 4 days. What she found was not a smoking gun records, that old had been partially digitized and partially mishandled, but there were gaps. A notation in the nursing log that referenced a visitor in the delivery suite during a period when I had been sedated. A name in the visitor register that did not belong to any of the medical staff, Diana Hargrove. I sat with that for a long time. Then, I requested the DNA test. The testing service I used accepted third-party samples with proper consent forms. The little girl's name, I had learned from the file, was Ellie. She had been placed temporarily with a family caretaker while her grandmother, Diana Hargrove, listed as legal guardian, sought to formalize the arrangement. The irony of this, that Diana had brought her granddaughter to a family law attorney to secure permanent custody from me, was the kind of thing that would have been funny in a different universe. Getting Ellie's DNA sample required consent from the legal guardian. I went through proper channels. I told Diana Hargrove's attorney that I had a conflict of interest and needed to verify whether a familial connection existed before I could represent or refer the case. It was technically accurate. It was also the most tightly controlled panic I have ever experienced while speaking in a professional setting. Diana Hargrove called me herself that afternoon. I had not heard her voice in 9 years. It was the same. Controlled. Precise. With that particular quality of warmth that lived only on the surface. Miss Dawson, she said. I understand you've raised a concern about the case. I have. A pause. What kind of concern? The kind that requires a DNA test before I can proceed. The silence that followed was different from the first one. It was the silence of someone recalibrating. I don't think that will be necessary, she said. I do. Claire. It was the first time she had used my first name. In 9 years, the first time she had acknowledged, in any form, that I was a person she knew. This is a simple guardianship case. Ellie has been with me since she was a newborn. She doesn't know anything different. Whatever you think you. I need you to come in, I said. This week. Without your attorney, if you're willing, just to talk. Another silence. Then. Fine. She came on a Thursday afternoon. She was 71 years old, and she looked it in a way she hadn't the last time I'd seen her. The architecture of her was the same upright posture, good coat, hair still carefully maintained, but something underneath had gone soft in a way that money couldn't fix. She sat across from me in my office and looked at me for a long moment before she said anything. You're going to request the test regardless of what I say. Yes. She nodded, slowly, as though this was information she had been waiting for without knowing she was waiting for it. Then I'd rather you hear it from me, she said. What Diana Hargrove told me over the next 40 minutes was not a confession designed to protect herself. It was something stranger and, in its own way, more devastating than that. It was the account of a woman who had made a decision she had spent 9 years refusing to call a mistake, and who had finally run out of the energy required to maintain that refusal. Ethan's death had broken something in her that she had never had the vocabulary to name. He was her only child. He had been, she said, the only person who had ever argued back against her and made her feel loved rather than defied. When she lost him, she lost the only version of herself she had ever actually liked. She had come to the hospital the night of my delivery not to do what she did. She had come, she said, to see if there was any part of Ethan left in the world. She had been sedated herself, she said, for weeks, grief and medication and the collapse of everything she had organized her life around. She arrived at the hospital and a nurse recognized her name. The Hargrove Foundation had funded 2 wings of that hospital. Doors opened. She had stood outside the delivery suite and listened to my daughter cry. And then she had made a decision in the space of 30 seconds that she had spent 9 years constructing justifications for. She told herself I was unstable. That I had caused the accident, not directly, but by being exactly what she had always said I was, a person whose ambition exceeded her attachment. She told herself the baby deserved better. She told herself she would give her everything, stability, resources, a name. She told herself that what she was doing was not stealing. That it was rescuing. She had connections in that hospital, old connections, financial connections. A doctor who owed his research grant to the Hargrove Foundation made one phone call to 2 nurses. Ellie was declared stillborn. Another infant, a child who had truly died that same night, whose family had released the remains, was placed in my arms while I was barely conscious. I had held someone else's baby. I had buried someone else's child. She told me this and I sat very still and did not say anything for a long time. Then I said, "Where did you get the locket?" She looked down at her hands. "I found it. In the supply bag you'd left at the nurse's station. I kept it. I don't know why. I thought it was hers. I thought she should have it." A pause. "I gave it to her when she was 4. I told her it was from her mother." "It was," I said. Diana closed her eyes. I had expected rage. I had rehearsed versions of this moment for years without knowing I was rehearsing it, not this specific version, but the general shape of it, the moment when someone would finally have to account for the damage they'd done to my life. I had expected to feel the release of 9 years of compressed fury. What I felt was exhaustion. Deep cellular exhaustion. The kind that comes not from anger, but from finally being allowed to stop carrying something, I said. "I'm going to file a report with Child Protective Services." I'm going to request emergency custody on the basis of fraud and misrepresentation. I'm going to pursue every legal remedy available to me. And I want you to understand that I'm not doing any of that to hurt you." She opened her eyes. "Then, why?" "Because I want my daughter to know the truth came from official record, not just from my word and yours. I want there to be paperwork. I want there to be a file that says what happened, that can never be sealed or lost or explained away." She nodded. "And I want her to know you loved her," I said, and I was surprised by how much I meant it and how much it cost me to mean it. "Whatever you did. However it started. She was with you for 9 years, and you loved her. I am not going to take that from her." Diana Hargrove put both hands over her mouth. Her shoulders shook once, twice, and then she pressed her hands harder and held still. The legal process moved faster than I had expected, partly because I knew exactly how to navigate it and partly because Diana did not fight it. Her attorney contacted mine within 48 hours with an offer to cooperate fully. The DNA results came back in 8 days. The match was 99.998%. The hospital launched an internal investigation. 2 nurses had retired, one was located and gave a deposition. The doctor who had made the original call had died of a heart attack 3 years earlier, which closed that particular door. The hospital's legal team reached out to my attorney before the investigation was 2 weeks old. The settlement offer they made was significant enough that my attorney read it twice before saying anything. I donated half of it to the legal aid nonprofit where I had worked for 7 years. The other half I put in a trust for Lily. For Ellie. I was still learning to call her Lily. She had been Ellie for 9 years, and I was not going to force anything. The first time I met her as her mother officially, formally. With the paperwork in place and the custody transferred, I drove to the temporary foster placement where she was staying, and I sat in the parking lot for 11 minutes before I could make myself go in. She was sitting at a table doing homework. She looked up when I walked in. And her face did the thing that children's faces do when they are trying to figure out how much to feel. Cautious. Curious. A little defiant, the way kids are when they've been through too much, too fast, and have decided to stop trusting adults to be consistent. "Hi," I said. I sat down across from her without being asked, because I didn't want to loom. "I'm Claire." "I know who you are," she said. "I know." I thought I'd say it anyway. I put my hands on the table where she could see them. "You don't have to call me anything right now. We can figure that out later." She looked at my hands. Then she looked at my face. "Did you really not know?" she said. "All this time?" "No," I said. "I didn't know. I thought you died." She absorbed this with the seriousness of a child who has already had to absorb several things she shouldn't have had to absorb at her age. "That's really sad," she said. "It was," I said. "Yeah." She went back to her homework. I stayed for an hour. We talked about what she was learning in school. She was fascinated by weather systems, she told me, especially tornadoes, and about what kind of food she liked and didn't like, and about the fact that she was ambivalent about dogs but strongly pro-cat, which made me tell her about Harold, which made her want to meet Harold with an urgency that surprised me and made me laugh for the first time in what felt like a very long time. Diana had 1 more month. She'd been diagnosed with early-stage Alzheimer's 18 months earlier, which was part of why she had finally begun the process of formalizing custody. She had wanted to make sure Ellie was placed before her cognitive decline progressed beyond what she could manage. Lily visited her twice before she moved in with me. I drove her there and waited in the car and let them have their time. I don't know what was said. I didn't ask. What I know is that Lily came back to the car the second time carrying a photograph, small and old, of a young man standing in front of a lake holding a child's kite. She handed it to me without speaking and watched my face. "That's your dad," I said, when I could. "Grandma said he was nice," she said. "He was," I said. "He was one of the nicest people I ever met." She looked at the photograph for another moment. "Do you think he would have liked me?" I turned to face her in the passenger seat. This small, serious, remarkable person who had Ethan's eyes and my stubbornness and 9 years of her own life that belonged entirely to her, that I had not been there for, and could not get back. He would have been crazy about you, I said. I promise. She put the photograph in her lap and looked out the window and was quiet for a while. Then she said, "Okay, I believe you." Moving her in took one afternoon. She didn't have much, which broke my heart in a specific, practical way that I channeled into buying her things. I probably should have asked her about first new bedding, a lamp shaped like a storm cloud with a lightning bolt nightlight, a shelf for the rocks she'd started collecting. She stood in the doorway of what had been my guest room and looked at all of it with an expression I couldn't fully read. "This is a lot," she said. "I know," I said. "I went a little overboard. We can return whatever you don't want." She walked in and touched the cloud lamp. She turned it on. The tiny bolt of light glowed soft yellow. She turned it off. She turned it on again. "I want this one," she said. The first few months were not easy, and I would not pretend otherwise. Lily woke up screaming twice in the first week, old nightmares she'd been managing on her own and hadn't learned yet to manage with someone else nearby. We had a therapist, a good one, who saw her on Wednesdays and who told me during our parent sessions to let her lead and to not try to fill every silence. I was not naturally good at not filling silences. I had spent 9 years talking to Harold, but I was learning. Some nights she asked me about Ethan and I told her everything I could, the taco truck proposal, the 4-hour conversation about suspicious shrimp, the way he believed so simply and stubbornly that people were worth fighting for. She listened with her knees pulled to her chest, very still, in the way that meant she was storing it. Some nights she asked about the years I'd missed and I told her those things too, the honest version, the version that included sitting in a parking lot unable to go inside and looking at the ultrasound photo once a year on her birthday and not knowing if I was allowed to call it her birthday. "That's really sad," she said again, the same way she'd said it the first time. "Yeah," I said. "It really was. But you're okay now." I thought about it. "I'm getting there," I said. "Are you?" She thought about it too, which I appreciated. She didn't rush to reassure me. "I think so," she said finally. "It's weird here, but it's okay weird. Good weird or bad weird." "Good weird," she said, after considering this very seriously. "Mostly." I took that. I took it the way you take something fragile and precious and unexpected carefully with both hands, making sure not to press too hard. In the spring, 4 months after Lily moved in, we drove out to Glacier Ridge Metro Park on a Saturday with sandwiches and a kite she'd picked out herself, bright red with a yellow tail. We hiked to the top of the ridge, and she ran ahead of me on the trail, the way kids run, with their whole bodies, with no thought for what might be on the other side. At the top of the hill, she turned around and held the kite up and looked at me. And her face in the sunlight was so entirely itself, not mine, not Ethan's, but the specific irreplaceable thing that she had grown into through 9 years of living, that I had to stop walking for a moment. "What?" she said. "Nothing," I said. "Let's fly it." We ran along the ridge until the wind caught it and it shot upward, straining at the string, pulling hard. Lily screamed with pure joy and I held on behind her with my arms around her shoulders and we both looked up at the red kite climbing into a sky so blue it looked painted. "Dad would have liked this," she said. I pressed my face into the top of her head. "He really would have." She tilted her head back against my shoulder and the kite pulled and the wind came up the ridge in a long warm wave and we held on together and didn't let go.